Welcome back to another flight debrief, but from a slightly different perspective than the last few, as this flight was overall one that could be tagged as uneventful. But that doesn't mean there isn't a notepad full of takeaways to reflect on. So let's get into it. Now, this flight was planned as a mostly direct flight leaving Chicago's executive Saturday afternoon. Knowing that anytime the tower is open, a departure from Chicago Executive will involve one of the departure procedures, I filed the one that best fit the forecast winds aloft to try and capture the best tailwind I could. However, it was also the weekend of the Chicago Air and Water Show, and also Orville Wright's birthday, so happy National Aviation Day. But the Air and Water Show puts a rather large TFR in the middle of the normal approach corridor to O'Hare. Consequently, that means that Executive is not using their normal Monks 5 or Giorgio 5 departures for most traffic, but are instead using the Pewaukee 5 departure. Now, as a point of confusion for me, is that using ForeFlight to plan, I'm not able to insert the Pewaukee 5 departure into my filing, but it is available under the Airport Information tab and does exist in my GPS navigator. The confusion isn't limited to just me either, as when I called up for my clearance, there was noticeable hesitation from the clearance controller. I had received the Monks 5 departure as filed when ForeFlight confirmed my route. And as we already talked about, since most of the jets leaving for the day were on the Pewaukee 5 departure, the controller's confusion was justified. Now, the main difference between these two departures is that the Pewaukee 5 departure is a right turn off of 16 instead of the typical left turn. The Pewaukee 5 is also only given when runway 22 is in use at O'Hare, and due to the aforementioned Lakefront Air Show, 22 was in use. Now, the Monks 5, on the other hand, is radar vectors on handoff from the tower, but it's not a required direction of turn, merely a typical one, as a right turn for many jets would be very tight to avoid the Bravo cutout Executive has. Now, our tower is a training environment for controllers, as it is for many pilots, and this weekend presents some good learning experiences every year. No fault or negatives assumed here, but it was a takeaway that neither pilots nor controllers are infallible, and we all work together to create a system that operates quite smoothly and safely. It's also a good reminder that even though ForeFlight confirmed an approved flight plan, things can still change, and it's just something to roll with. I've heard plenty of pilots getting upset with controllers over minor changes, but I'm choosing to focus more on how I can safely depart within my abilities and the system's expectations of my actions. Another element of note on this flight was that, at least for Chicagoland, this was shaping up to be the hottest weekend in August, and indeed one of the hottest weekends of the summer. Although we were departing with a surface temperature of around 27 Celsius, which is pretty normal, it was also expected to be a plus 5 Celsius at our filed altitude of 16,000. Now, this is 12 and 23 degrees over ISA respectively, and as such, the plane's performance will be impacted. This is something I try to plan for every departure. So when ATC requested during our climb,
1 Bravo Golf, expedite up to 6, please.
I thought back to my climb tables when deciding if I could accommodate the request. In the end, I had left some margin to increase my climb, and since I knew that meant a turn to the south with less delay, I tried to accommodate. Now, at our destination, surface temperatures were expected to be in excess of 40 degrees Celsius, and this was something I needed to factor into my landing performance. My pitch and power settings that I'm habituated to in Chicago, and certainly on the cooler parts of the year, are going to be different, approaching 100 degree Fahrenheit plus temperatures in Jackson, Mississippi. Once again, I'm glad this has been ingrained into me to be a normal part of cross-country preparation. I'm not convinced that many Part 61 flight schools are going to have the same stress on this topic that they might put into other things. Mine did not. Yours might. But fortunately, I did my instrument training in my own plane and with an independent instructor. So thank you, James, for going beyond what the school would have in preparing me for days like this. Now, you Part 141 folks will probably be a little bit more prepared in this aspect. Once we made it to 6,000, we were vectored south along the west side of O'Hare, and I'll never cease to be amazed at some of the infrastructure we have to accommodate all of the people, cargo, and business that modern airports handle. To me, this view is almost as cool as some of the IFR cloud surfing, so I did take a moment and grabbed a picture of it. Now, unlike some of my other videos recently, The cruise portion of this flight was predominantly uneventful. The only remarkable thing to me is that Alila, who as long as I've known her has never slept for even 10 seconds on a commercial flight, managed to nod off for about 45 cumulative minutes during the flight. And yes, she opted to leave the oxygen off initially, but she was still saturated around 95% when she put it on about 15 minutes after reaching cruise. I suppose the fitness side hustle that she has helps on the oxygenation, but at the same time, I'm sort of hoping she doesn't watch this and hear me admit to the fact that I could, and probably should, be doing a little bit more for my own fitness and oxygenation abilities to perhaps conserve a little bit on that expense. Anyway, with the air and water show behind us, it was just a few hours of ATC handoffs, some rubbernecking out the window, and playing my favorite game of trying to anticipate who I'm going to be handed off to. Along the way, I briefed a few approaches as I did see the wind slowly shifting at our destination. And sure enough, they went from landing 1-6 to landing 3-4 right about the time we hit Tennessee. There is something I find interesting, and maybe it's attributable to being still relatively new to long cross-country flights, and admittedly rather young at flying in general, but it is interesting the differences I experience flying around my home airport in terms of radio clutter and traffic density versus what I experience flying into other quote-unquote big airports. When I started my primary VFR training, Tursa's, Charlie's, and Bravo airspace were insanely intimidating. I know I'm not alone here, as the radios are what more new pilots are afraid of interacting with than just about anything else. But now flying around Chicago feels somewhat normal, and when I fly into some Charlie airports, they sometimes feel slow. I understand this isn't true everywhere, but it's an interesting development in my perception and something I'm taking note of. Chicago Executive has around 300 to 325 aircraft operations per day on average. And it's not uncommon to be waiting behind 5 or 6 other planes waiting to leave or 3 or 4 consecutive arrivals, not to mention 2 different news helicopters based on the field that are frequently coming and going. By contrast, my last 2 Charlie Airport experiences in Knoxville and now Jackson have around 250 and under 100 operations per day, respectively. This is becoming an observation that will factor into my future flight planning that Delta, Charlie, or Bravo isn't the only designation to indicate complexity. In fact, there's at least 3 Bravo airports that are comparable to Chicago Executive in volume, and there are other GA airports like Deer Valley that are way busier. Now, because cruise was so uneventful, I'm going to fast forward a bit to our approach into Jackson. And as we approach Jackson, I'm reminded that visually finding the airport out in the distance is a skill that needs constant work. Now, I can pick out features in Chicagoland pretty quickly, having spent most of my life there. Even when I'm coming from an atypical direction, I know the relationship of towns and features and can quickly confirm to ATC that I have the field in sight. And the same thing doesn't hold true when I approach a new field. The MFD moving map, ForeFlight, and the GPS DME are all very helpful, but I am required to reference the maps, and then the window, and then the maps, and continue to repeat until I am confident I have eyes on the right field. There is always a slight sense of nervousness around any uncertainty that is approaching a new airfield, but it becomes even more elevated when the tower throws me an audible. Approach cleared me for the visual approach into 3-4 left, and that matched the ATIS saying they were landing 3-4 left. But tower came in and asked if I wanted 3-4 right. As I was on the east side of the field, this kind of made sense. And there's 2 reasons that I decided to accept this. First, and most importantly, this means I won't be crossing another runway's final approach path. Now, it's not a busy airport, but that's still a non-zero risk. Secondarily, but not of zero importance, is that my FBO is on the east side of the airport as well, and it means a substantially shorter taxi from the new runway assignment. And this brings me to having to deal with the earlier mentioned temperatures and their effects on my landing performance. Now, recently, I've noticed my landings have started to recede in their accuracy and vary in their gentleness. Where during my IFR check ride, I was touching down right on the 1,000-foot marks and using my aiming point the way I learned in primary training, I've started to get a little bit too relaxed in my attention to detail. Although my pitch and power settings are going to be different here, and you'll hear the stall horn a bit higher than I'd like, this landing was somewhat oddly not as bad as some of the other recent ones. Even Alila said it was the best one she'd been along with in several months. They can still use some work, obviously, and I do have a flight training video hopefully coming soon showing my work on that. But for now, we're back on the ground and ready to head out into some 100-degree plus weather for the weekend. Now, as you may have noticed, this was a clear, beautiful day and a flight that was free of any major errors. But that doesn't mean there isn't plentiful opportunity to pull learnings and continue to grow. And by the way, if you're enjoying these flight debriefs, click that like button and subscribe down below to encourage me to keep going with them. And feel free to sound off in the comments. Did I do something well? Or did I miss something that I should have been paying attention to? I'm curious to know if you take away something different than I do from this flight. But until the next one, thanks for watching.
Nice. Good job.